So I'm going to play a clip from Daniel's latest talk at the Norrsken Foundation. It's worth watching the entire thing, but I picked this clip in particular because it frames things in a really cool way. To such an extent as really, at least for me, instills a desire to take a lot of rope and run with it. Like really give yourself a lot of leeway and room and just quarterback, okay, well, what would it take to do this thing that he's talking about? And so that's what I want to do. So I'm going to play the clip and then, we'll try to take this into the end zone. So watch it and then, we'll get into the weeds of it. Here you go.
There are a small number of people who are motivated by power exclusively, pretty exclusively, and then there's most everyone else who just needs to pay the bills and not rock the boat too much and wants to feel like they will do good things within the confines of that. So I guess I don't want people to think about how to make their own life regenerative because it doesn't matter. I don't want people to think about how to make Sweden regenerative. I want people to think about what it would take to turn the entire arc of humanity, factoring what is currently driving it, and that everything else that you could do doesn't matter at all because the end of the possibility space of all meaningful human activities is imminent if we don't do that. That's what I'm reflecting on.
So there you have it. What would it take to turn the entire arc of human history, factoring what's driving it? What's driving it is, I would call it erroneous sense-making or an erroneous relationship to reality and to each other, as well as a whole lot of other fucking things. But let's say that you understand some of that to some extent. So what would it take? Like just, again, let's take a lot of rope and postulate what would it take. Well, I'm going to throw out 5 specific points of consideration that come to mind as I watch this. Screw it, I'll just put them on here. So 5 points of consideration of these. 5th point is a kind of a mystery point. We'll get into that when we get to it. So I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes on each. And love to get your thoughts on these. So first point of consideration is, I found this just the other day. It's inspired by Buckminster Fuller. It's called the Planet Live Project. So check it out and even pause this video and click it. I'll put a visual on the screen or play a little short clip of it. But it's a pretty awesome visualization of the entire Earth systems and how they're interconnected with one another. So you can see all of this data and how it plays with each other and keep up with it in real time. And again, the main thing to be taking into account with all of this is the fact that if you're a doctor trying to fix a body and you're only looking at the heart or the lungs at the expense of the rest, you ain't fixing shit. This is a huge interconnected system. As difficult as it is to do, you need to look at the whole goddamn thing. So you gotta, first of all, you gotta look at the whole goddamn thing. And to me, look at it in a way that's accessible to some extent. Some accessible map. Sure, the map is not the terrain, but maps are useful. Maps are useful. Just because the map ain't the terrain doesn't mean it's not useful. You got to operate from something. So that's the first bit. And what I would also tag onto that is, which we'll take into account with the third point, is a huge metric as to whether or not we're going to succeed in this, no matter what it is we're doing, is how many bodies we're able to get into this space. And that's motivated from 2 things, really. One, a terrible precedent of not giving people on-ramps to get involved in actually impactful civic work. I'm going to sit down. And secondly, most things people will say live or die based off of their funding, but it's a little more nuanced than that. You can get funding from a source that has ulterior motives and strings attached, which is usually because the person that's the funder doesn't understand the problem or is, I don't know, some nuthead or something. And so that's still in the category of a body. And by body, I mean somebody that understands the meta crisis to such an extent as to be a useful conduit within it. And this Planet Live project would be a highly accessible way to get people into it of, here's the meta crisis, here's the map of the landscape, here's what we need to do, here's the whole dashboard of civic work that needs doing. What's the most appropriate role for you to play within this? And here's how to get connected to them. It's really not that fucking hard. It's not a rocket scientist at the end of the day. Like, that's kind of generally what would need to happen. Now we'll get into what needs to happen because, you got to do that. So, secondly is peak collaboration. And this is another deceptively simple thing of these problems in the world. No one has the cognitive complexity to be able to get their head wrapped around all of it, including Daniel Schmachtenberger. He says that himself. You're going to want to take into the experts of economics and technology and AI and environment and politics and governance. So many different disciplines have to come together to really understand the totality of the nature of the problem. And so I've been bashing my head against a fucking wall for a while of like, why the hell do we not just get those individuals? And it's going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. Sometimes you think that these are the traditional experts, but they're not the people you want to take into account. I'm talking guys like Daniel Schmachtenberger and Zach Stein and Nora Bateson and Ian McGilchrist, and then a whole lot of other scientists and API people that I'm not as familiar with. But every field, try to find the most appropriate individuals to get that have a certain collaborative inclination and put them in a room together, and you stay in this collaborative setting until you really, and using a Planet Live project model, to just say, okay, how do we skin this? What's the appropriate course of action? If we imagine somehow doing fairly decently, comparatively, realistically speaking, 20 years from now, how would that have to come to pass? And to me, that's not that hard of a question, actually. It's hard, but it's not that hard. You can do a pretty quick process of elimination of how that wouldn't get done. If you're in 2050, or if you are a time traveler and jump to 2050 and people are telling you some story about how we fixed things, and they start going on about how, oh, you know what? Yeah, Mark Zuckerberg fixed everything. Or the governments of the world got their heads out of their butts and figured out how to fix everything. Or, I don't know, Donald Trump, like, I'm just throwing out examples, but there's plenty of scenarios that you can just toss out a hand and say, yeah, that's not realistic to happen. Because there's only so many ways it's going to happen. So you do the process of elimination of how it's not going to happen. Then you just fill in the inescapable eventualities of like, well, it's not going to happen without these things happening. In terms of the larger model, taking everything into account, some of these near-term risks and tipping points that would have to be avoided. And so you start from that place, and then you map out further from there. It gives you some place to go. So peak collaboration, you get all these individuals in a room, and you might say, Ben, that's been done. Show me, please, because I've seen versions of it, but not to the extent that I'm talking about, and not to the degree where they don't leave until they figured it out. Like, this shouldn't have to be that fucking hard. If we're serious and the problem is quite as dire as it's being framed, why aren't we doing that? I mean, isn't that kind of what they did with the Manhattan Project? I know it's a weird example, but when you're serious about accomplishing something at any costs, like the Oppenheimer movie and Manhattan Project, they just got all the necessary minds involved, put them in a desert until they figured out how to build this thing. And again, remove the fact that they're working on a nuclear bomb, I'm not talking about that, but in order to accomplish a thing, navigating the meta crisis, what would it take to, turn the arc of the entirety of humanity? Why aren't we doing that? And so that's the second one. I'd love to get into a conversation on how that comes to pass. I understand that's been done to some extent before. Maybe there's work being done to do that. Maybe it's done behind the scenes. Great. Well, more of it, because none of this is adequate until it feels like, you know what? The whole suite of work that's being done now, if you play it out 10 years, I'm satisfied by that. That's about as much as we could be realistically expected to do. Until a person can say that, then what the fuck are we talking about? So, third point. What's the third point? Point A to point B. That's that whole point of creating better on-ramps and funneling, streamlining for people, regular people, okay, like you and I, to go from point A being the very common feeling of doom and gloom and existential dread of the world's screwed and what do I do about it? And if you're not careful, you just run into the forest and do a lotus eater and just, get depressed and nihilistic. How do you get people from that point A of, oh shit, things are screwed, to point B being, oh wow, I understand the nature of the problem. Not only do I understand the nature of the problem, I understand to a certain extent what needs doing and who's doing it and what role I can play within that suite of civic work. How do you shorten the path from that? How do you streamline that? Because like I've said before, you need just to get bodies into this. All right. I mean, it's been postulated before. We need to foster the conditions for popular zeitgeist to shift the needle and turn the tide, right? Well, then we need to do that. And there's pretty accessible ways of doing that. In fact, that Cambridge Analytica thing that I won't shut up about, you could do something like that, but instead of recommending content for people, you pair them with the most appropriate community or, group or individual or mentor or teacher or school or even an online community, let's say, to them. I say actually in person. That was a big shifting point for me, was actually finding people that I had a lot in common with, which led to the next thing and the next and the next thing. And then I ended up working in civic work in a way that was satisfying to me. And so you can help people with that. All right. It's such a saturated space. It's very difficult for people to traverse that landscape. And so doing something like the Cambridge Analytica idea of, whether it's an opt-in process or not, like, help people out, because if you don't, I understand for myself that for every success story like mine, if you can even call it that, there's 10 other people that have been trying to get involved in civic work that are now homeless in LA because it's very difficult to figure out how to do that. We need to help people just for the fact that it sets a terrible precedent not to. So that's the third point. Fourth point, points of consideration. I hear a lot about risk, of understanding the second, third order consequences and potential externalities. 100% yes. I think that it has to be taken into account that, yes, what drives that inclination is recognizing that up till now, a lot of work has not done that. And that if we're going to get past this, we can't be doing what's been done because they're not actually taking into account all the risk and externalities. We have to be careful not to overcorrect. There's no scenario without risk. And please, for the love of God, if I am wrong and there's some scenario without risk and trade-offs, let me know. I think that's absurd to think that that's possible. And now you're doing more harm than good by trying to seek out a holy grail that is truly unachievable. There's a certain threshold of like realistically expectable trade-offs and risk, and then you go. And it's so simple that it's like you're trying to put out a fire and you're avoiding certain particularly treacherous ways of trying to put out the fire that might, cost certain lives. At what point, non-rhetorically, like when the fire's like literally burning your feet, do you start taking out the big guns? Because if you can't have your cake and eat it too, if this is as existential as it is, I'm sorry, but extraordinary problems require extraordinary solutions, which come with extraordinary risk. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. Yes, you have to do the yellow teaming and red teaming and taking into account second order consequences. That comes with the territory. But because there's no scenario with zero risk, you need to do all the most appropriate risk analysis that you can, mitigate the risks where you can, and then go. Like that's going to tie into the fifth and last point, which, are we ready for the fifth and last point? I'm on points of consideration. So what else do I got on points of consideration? Another common thing other than risk is extraordinary problems require no extraordinary solutions, but they come extraordinary risk. They also come with a certain degree of power, because every solution I see, that's usually a common argument against it, because it's kind of inescapable. In order to apply control systems and highly powerful control civic efforts, people are like, that's a lot of power in a certain person's hands. There's a lot of overcorrecting with that as well. And it kind of comes from this whole absolute power corrupts absolutely, which is such a one-dimensional, static idea. That's not static. If you look at individuals throughout history that have had absolute power, is it a straight line? Are they all equally bad with their power? There's no distribution or spectrum there at all? Of course not. For every Genghis Khan and Pol Pot, you got a Marcus Aurelius who still was negligent with his power in some capacities, but not compared to Genghis Khan or Pol Pot. And so they're all very different scenarios, but the reasons that some of them, let's say Marcus Aurelius, were better stewards of their power, ain't a goddamn mystery. They had better stewards in their lives. He had the Stoics and Epictetus. So what I'm getting at with that is there's a certain inevitability of power. And you can only distribute risk so many different ways. Checks and balances doesn't destroy the risk, it just disperses the risk. You know, democracies can still crumble from death by 1,000 cuts versus death by 1 cut. It comes back to the sense making of the operators. And so the best way to illustrate this, I think, is if you imagine a relative balance beam where it gets thinner on one end and wider on the other. So there's always risk of falling, but there's comparatively less risk on the wider part of the balance beam and more risk on the thinner part. Let's say that in principle, the person on the balance beam has lower qualitative sense making. They don't understand critical thinking skills. They don't have a really good understanding or operational sense making in any meaningful way. They're on the thinner part, and they're higher risk of falling or becoming corrupted. And if someone in principle has better qualitative sense making, a better understanding of reality, they're on the wider part. There's still risk of corruptibility, but it's less so. There are no perfect arbiters of sense making. We need to get this out of our heads. And I think we have to come to some point where no one's just going to come in and save us. This is something that we've got to figure out, realistically speaking, how do we operate with what we do have and do what can be realistically expected from the, silly hairless apes that we are, and do what needs doing to, again, turn the entire arc of human history through this very difficult period. And so let me do a recap, make sure I've got everything. This is ended up being a little longer than I would have liked, but those are the 5 points. Oh yeah, 5th point. Pull the fucking trigger. It's 2023, and we had the hottest summer on record. We're hitting tipping points up the yin-yang. How bad does it have to get before we take the big guns? I know I've said this before, but whether you call it pull the trigger or push the envelope or, pull the lever, we need to start acting. And you can say, Ben, we've been acting. Do you see any of these exponential curves plateauing? Like I said, again, until such a time that the whole suite and dashboard of civic work that's currently being done feels adequate to the problem, then we're not done yet. And so there still needs to be that ever-present dutiful vigilance to say, what is it going to take? Let's not overcomplicate it. This is actually something to put in the points of consideration thing, that the subtle point that has a lot of consequence is, yes, no one has the cognitive complexity to understand everything. But is there such a thing as an absolute objective metric of complexity where you get things that are so fucking complex? I would say no. It's relative to a certain extent. It's not as complex to an actual rocket scientist, the inner workings of a rocket, as it would be to me. And so you could say, well, the actual configuration of the wiring isn't any different. But I'm talking about operationally, in reality, in terms of operating. And what I'm getting at with that is these problems can be put on such a pedestal and say that they're so complex, and that can inhibit people from actually seeing that without being reductionist, you can nail down the basics of what has to happen, like that Planet Live project map of the space that's not the terrain, and getting all the brightest individuals in a room and collaboratively working through what has to get done. Let's say with augmented AI to help with that to some extent, right? And you put together the entire dashboard of everything that needs doing, and you even start to make that public, that comes with the map, so that people that are going from that path A to point B to figure out, okay, well, I'll understand the meta-crisis. What's my role to play within that landscape of civic work? Oh, wow, here's a map of the entirety of all of the different systems and how they're interplaying with each other, as well as what's being done to save biodiversity, to offer a place for refugees, to do corporate reform and educational reform, to certain environmental initiatives, AI projects, mitigating risks in certain parts of the world. Like, where could I volunteer? What skills do I have to bring to the table? And how can I get to an appropriate place of involvement for me to feel like, okay, I'm now operating in a way that I can live with. And the last thing I'd love to throw in this that to me is so impactful that it changed my life overnight when I got this. And it's very counterintuitive, and I've said it to a certain extent before, is it feels like, and this is something I kind of disagree with just a little bit whenever Daniel talks about how if you're depressed at this, yeah, be depressed, work through that depression. To a certain extent, yeah, I feel like I could look at what I'm about to say in my own life as having done that, working through that depression, staring it in the face. But another way of looking at it that I think needs to be taken into account is instead of just saying, oh yeah, this is objectively emotionally distressing, there's no reason to rationalize out of that. Yes, to an extent. But on the flip side, when operating effectively on any project, if you keep holding this deep emotional weight, believe it or not, it really cuts you at your knees in terms of how effective you're able to be. There's a lot of mental health issues in this civic landscape. And so hear me out, but in almost every other context, and I'm going to use 3 quick examples in sports and entertainment and music. When you've done the work, and the work needs to be done, and a good framing to keep in all of this from James P. Carson's Finite Infinite Games is you want to contain the serious within the playful. So you need the serious, but the playful actually should take paramount, which is what I'm talking about. So starting off, when you look at sports, Kobe Bryant said a lot of times in interviews that, yeah, I've done all the practice, he outworked everybody else and all of that, but whenever it came to hitting a game-winning shot in these high-tension situations, what it really came down to was whether or not he was operating somewhat playfully. If he treated it like a high-tension situation, he would miss. But whenever he treated it like a backyard game of basketball with his brother, he would hit it. And then in acting auditions, Robert Downey Jr. and others have said that, yeah, I've done all the work to become a well-trained actor, but when I'm in an audition, if I treat it like a high-tension situation, I'm going to screw it up. If I have fun with it as an acting exercise, I'm probably going to nail it. Or at least I'm going to do better comparatively speaking. And same thing with music, a highly trained cello player, let's say, in an orchestra, he's done all the work, but whenever he's playing, if he's treating it like a high-tension thing, he's probably going to screw up. If he enjoys what he's doing, it's beautiful. And I would say the same goes for operating with the meta-crisis. Do the necessary work to understand all the underlying conditions involved that you need to understand to operate effectively, and enjoy the process. This is fucking fun. Okay? I'm not fucking kidding about that. I wouldn't change a word of that. I grew up playing with Legos all the time. I'm kind of an innate problem solver. I was a mathematics major and a philosophy major, and I just love sinking my teeth into a nice rich problem, whether it's a Sudoku puzzle or a Rubik's Cube. This is the Rubik's Cube of Rubik's Cubes. How often do you get a chance to solve multipolar traps and existential risk? Gamify this. Like, I would go as far as to say that, yeah, that dashboard, suite of civic work and that map of the space and landscape, like, why can't we just have like a situation room, task desk, war room of, individuals gamifying this and a fucking Justice League A-Team Task Force Avengers initiative to say, okay, what needs doing? Let's do those things and have fun. You're probably going to be more effective. And so that's what I would like to leave you with. I think it's a great thing. In fact, no, one last thing. There's a lot of different reasons why to do all of this. And so I think it's actually an important thing to say, even though it feels like it comes with the territory. Why wouldn't you do it? No, it's important to nail down exactly what your why is. And it was a struggle for me for a long time to figure out, well, why apply yourself to something that's probably going to fail anyway? It's probably a thankless task and you're going to die anyway. It's like, these are important questions. I realized that any finite operational protocol of, will I cease to exist at death, is, I think, the bare minimum comparatively far less fulfilling than an infinite-based protocol. What I mean by that is, however you come to the conclusion that in some capacity, you're even just slightly likely, or let's say that just operate as though you do, exist beyond this life in some capacity. I really want to skirt that because who knows what it is? Nobody knows, and I'm agnostic on about it. But I think it can't be tossed out of hand that there is a decent chance that consciousness continues in some capacity. So let's just operate from there. That is what I would call an infinite protocol. Well, as long as you can establish that, to me, the most obvious natural conclusion from that is that I now want to get good at existing if I have no choice but to exist beyond this life in some meaningful capacity. And so to get good at existing means getting good at resolving these kinds of problems. I don't think these are human-specific problems. These are sentient problems. These are sentient individuals trying to figure out how to operate with each other and not hoard resources and work collaboratively and not fall into these rivalrous, competitive, multipolar traps. How often do you have a chance to operate off of this? And avoiding them is like sets a kind of bad precedent of like, oh yeah, I'll be in the middle of an existential crisis and oh, it's not my responsibility, I'm just going to do my own thing. That kind of sets a bad precedent. In my suspicion, if you continue to exist, you're probably just going to keep finding yourself in scenarios like this, and that precedent's going to play out in a bad way. So you can't avoid the consequences. Basically, they're going to come back around at some point. And so to get good at existing, in my opinion, is, oh yeah, I'm not going to operate in this just from some weird finite based, get the civilization to continue another couple of centuries. Because again, it ends eventually anyway. So why are we wanting it to continue indefinitely? It's not going to make it past the heat death of the universe. So to me, I operate from an entirely different vantage point of, I want to get good at existing. These are the problems of this century right now. This is what I have to work with. I don't want to set a bad precedent of ignoring them, so I'm going to operate within them, play an appropriate role to resolve them, and have a lot of fun doing it. That's my version of getting good at existing. And I don't try not to make a big deal of it. You get a lot of ego, and that cuts you at the knees as well. So just have fun with it. Don't make a big deal of it. And enjoy the ride. So that's what I've got for you. Apologies for the length of this. I'll try to chapterize it, and hopefully it's useful for anyone that watches this. And feel free to comment or drop a message or email me. And I love to get in the weeds on this, particularly if I've made some erroneous conjecture at some point in the midst of this, because it's not my intention to do so. So thank you very much for watching. And I'm gonna go take a nap because I had a lot of coffee in order to do this, and I'm kind of getting tired now. So thank you very much for watching, and adios.